Welcome to ADF Insider. In this two-part series about task flows, we introduce ADF task flows for beginners and intermediate developers. My name is Frank Nymphius and I'm from the Oracle Developer team. In this first part, we introduce basic concepts and fundamentals of ADF task flows. I introduce unbounded task flows, bounded task flows. I will talk about the different activities that exist for the two types of task flows. I will talk about exception handling, and I will end this session with talking about trains, which is a way to navigate between related views in a task flow. Before we start, let me introduce the demo that we're going to build. The sample application is a master detail behavior, where the master section is an input form that sits in the parent page. The detail is exposed in the bounded task flow that is added as an ADF region onto the same page. So when I navigate the master, then you see that the data in the detail refreshes accordingly. So I select one of the employees here, and then I have two buttons, one to edit the current record and the other one to undo the change. This here is a call to another bounded task flow, which provides the view for the editable forms to change the employee records. On top of it, you see a train navigation that allows to step through related views. So first, apply a change and making this all uppercase. Next step is to look at the job data and then eventually go to the HR data. And once we have all this, we can either cancel or submit. So we return to this detail, the detail table refreshes and we see that Shelley is all uppercase. Now I have the option in a bounded task flow to set a save point to which I can rewind all the actions I did. So if I press this, then I can undo my uppercase change to the first name. So let's press this button and Shelley is all lowercase and everything is undone. And how to build this and how this all happens and how task flow can be used for that, this is all part of the two series introduction to ADF task flow. The ADF controller is an extension of the Java Server Faces navigation model. But what is it that we mean when we talk about unbounded task flows or bounded task flows? Well, if you're having a Java Server Faces background, then you already know about unbounded task flow, because this is exactly what the Faces config file provides. Every view in this unbounded task flow is directly accessible from a browser, and then once you access the view, you can use the navigation flow of this unbounded task flow to route through the application. There are no well-defined boundaries, which means there's no entry point or exit point to an unbounded task flow. Usually you use this as a top-level entry to your application so that it only has one view, and in the ADF world you would then continue with bounded task flows. In ADF you can use the unbounded task flow to declaratively build menu models. So this would allow you to create a side view or a side menu that then you can use to have users navigating through the whole website of the application that you built. You can also use it for declarative bookmarking. Bookmarking in Java Server Faces is not as easy as you would think because of the dynamic nature of Java Server Faces. So when a user bookmarks a page, he or she would expect that they would get back to exactly the same data state that they bookmarked it in. And to achieve this, you have to provide query parameters with a bookmark URL, and this is what declarative bookmarking does for you. The bounded task flow is really what makes it worth using ADF task flow. They are reusable white boxes. They define navigation and processing, and you can take them and deploy them across applications or reuse them within your application. They have a single point of entry. That means that no matter how you get to the bounded task flow, it always starts with the same entry point. The well-defined boundary allows you to invoke code at the beginning, at the start of the bounded task flow, or when the user leaves the task flow. You can also at the end roll back or commit changes in the bounded task flow. Bounded task flows have their own memory scope, which I will introduce later, and they have a declarative transaction management, which we also talk about. The declarative back button support in bounded task flow allows you to declaratively specify if a task flow can be re-entered using the browser back button. If you define a bounded task flow to be not re-enterable, in this case we will raise an exception for the developer to handle, and then you can do the right thing that fits the best to the application. The communication between the outer world and the bounded task flow is always through input parameters and output parameters. This way there is no dependency that you will create between the task flow and its context it runs in. Control flow cases in ADF task flow are comparable to navigation cases in Java server faces. They allow you to define in metadata how a user could navigate from one view to another view, or in the ADF terms, from one activity to the next activity. A control flow case is a named event. So you have a origin, which is a page, and this origin raises the navigation event, and it does so by using a command item like a command button. And if this button in its action property has the name of the event, then Java server faces continuous navigation to the destination, to the other end of the definition there. And the way that you work with that is you just draw a line between the different activities in Oracle JDeveloper. Though everything ends up to be XML markup, the design term is visual, and you just draw a line and you name the line. As you see on the left hand side, there's a page help navigation defined for the edit record page, and this navigation event is only available for this page. On the other side, if you look at the right hand side, then there's a global navigation which starts with an asterisk. So the from activity ID is put on an asterisk, which means that no matter where in your application you are, whenever one of your command items returns global help as the event name, you end up in the application help. So before we go into Oracle JDeveloper to work on the demo and see how you develop with task flows live, let me introduce some of the task flow concepts so that you have a better understanding of what the different icons mean and what they do that I'm working with. The key concepts of ADF task flow are view activity to display the user interface, the pages and page fragments, activity flows, which are the equivalent to navigation flows in Java server faces, method execution to execute Java or binding methods, the router, which is kind of an if-else statement that helps you deciding on which path within the navigation tree you want to continue with. Return activity sits at the end of every bounded task flow to either commit, roll back the transaction, and to determine how in the calling application the process continues. Then we have the task flow call activity, which you use to nest bounded task flow. So one bounded task flow can call another bounded task flow, and you can go as deep as you want with that. And we have exception handling, which is a declarative way for you to define what to do in case of a specific exception. So instead of introducing an exception stack trace to the user. The view activity is a pointer to a physical file. So a view activity doesn't really own the page, so it has a relationship to the page. It points to the page, and it can point either to a JSPX document, in which case it's a full page, or to a page fragment, which is used when you expose views in an ADF region. You can configure the view activity to accept input parameters, though there are so many different ways to pass parameters between pages and views that this is not the only way of passing parameters here. But it can be used to read parameters from the request URL and then make sure they are used within the view. You can configure the view activity to perform a redirect into the typical Java surfaces postback navigation. You would do this to some degree, so if you want to have a synchronization between the browser URL and the current page that you see, that might be a reason for you to do that. It's not really used quite often. Bookmarking is a feature that we provide within unbounded task flows, and that allows users to take a bookmark of the URL of the current page, and then when they come back to rebuild the state of the page. And keep in mind that Java server faces really creates dynamic pages, so the data is a live query, it's no static data. Well, there is static data, but the data that you see, the business data, is not static. And to get a page back to exactly the same state, the same query state that you left it in, it requires some query parameters on the request URL, and this is what the bookmarkable feature provides. Train stop is the ability to add a view to the train navigation model. It's one way to have users navigating within an application to add a view activity to a train model, and we will have a look at this later. Method call activities allow you, while you navigate from one view to the next, to invoke a Java method or the ADF binding layer. So we see bindings.createExecute on the slide, which executes the create operation on the binding layer in the page definition file. Or you just call a managed bean method. You can pass parameters to the method, and you can get return values that you can either use for further navigation within the bounded task flow, or just to store the value in a managed bean or a memory scope for later use. The route activity, now this is a declarative way of evaluating a condition. That could be an attribute in a managed bean, in a memory, or that could be some information that you get from the binding layer. And then if a condition, like here, page flow scope action, which looks into the memory scope for an attribute action, if that is set to create, then navigation might go to a create page, where otherwise it goes to an edit page. Or you may want to check the security context. So if the user is a manager, then you might bring him to a management page, whereas otherwise they would continue with a normal flow. The outcome of the route activity defines how the action continues, how the navigation continues, and there's a default outcome that you set just in case that there's no condition that matches any of the outcome that you specified. In this case, at least there is something happening on the router, and it's not that the router stops there. The task flow call activity, as I mentioned, you use that to call a task flow, but there's another aspect to it, which is being able to call a remote application. You can deploy a bounded task flow with an application, in which case it's just deployed as a Java EE application to a server. And if this is a remote server and you want to use the bounded task flow, if the bounded task flow, for example, is a yellow page process where you can look up employees within the same company, then you might want to reach out to that bounded task flow deployed on a remote server, and then once you're done within that process, it will call back to the origin application that you started within, and it will pass back information. You can pass information to it, but it can then also pass back return values, and you continue working with that. Every bounded task flow has a before listener and an after listener in the task flow call activity, so that when entering or before you are about to enter a bounded task flow, you can execute some Java code, or when you return from a bounded task flow, you can have the after listener executed and performing some actions there. Task flows can be executed within a dialog, in which case they can either be launched as an external dialog, which will be in an external browser window, or inline in the page as an DHTML dialog. And this is configurable on the task flow call activity, and it's declarative. And then you can specify a task flow call activity to become a train stop. So if you have a train model set up, then one of the stops that you can navigate to would be a task flow call activity, which would allow you then to navigate to another bounded task flow. The return activity is important because every bounded task flow, unless you want to have it running infinite, needs to have some form of exit criteria. And the exit criteria is identified by the return activity. You navigate to the return activity, and based on what the configuration of the return activity is, it might just return from the bounded task flow, just providing an outcome that determines the further navigation in the calling task flow, or it may roll back a transaction, commit a transaction. That's all depending on the configuration there. One thing I'm sure you like with exceptions is honesty. Exceptions are very honest. If an exception shows, then obviously something went terribly wrong. What you don't like with exceptions is the way that they show to the user, usually exposing a stack trace, which then makes the user being puzzled or confused. ADF task flow allows you to declaratively specify exception handlers in a bounded task flow and in the unbounded task flow. And what it does is that this exception handler is called for whatever is going wrong. The exception handler can be marked as a router, as a method activity, or as a view activity, in which case you are given the chance to look into what the exception is and then do the best thing you can to handle the exception. In the best case, you just bring back the user into some sort of state that allows him or her to continue within the application. So you're not taking them out of the context, which is very important. Well, we are ready to go. So let's start building task flows. What you see here is the Application Navigator view for a project that is configured to use the ADF Controller. But how do you configure a project to use the ADF Controller instead of the default Java Server Faces navigation handler? The first option is when you create the application development project to start with a Fusion Web Application template. Selecting the Fusion Web Application template creates the View Controller project configured for ADF Faces and ADF Task Flow. The second option, which you would use for an existing project, is to double-click onto the project node, navigate to the technology scope, and select the ADF page flow entry in the list of available technologies to select it to the list of selected technologies. This will configure the project with the ADF Controller libraries, but also create the ADFC configuration file, ADFC config, which is the bootstrapping unbounded task flow configuration definition. It's always there, it's always created when you select the page flow technology scope. You see also that there's a Faces config file in the project. This is the standard Java Server Faces configuration file, and it's still used though you're using ADF Controller for your navigation. The Faces config file contains all the settings that are not navigation or not managed bean definitions. The Faces config file contains settings about the languages that you want to support in your application. It contains settings about converters that you want to use, pointers to resource bundles, and if you want to listen to a request lifecycle, a custom face listener. This is all in Faces config and many more. You also see that I created 2 pages as a starter for this demo. One is the browse departments.jspeaks page. It's a physical page that will be the landing pad, the initial page that users will request to start the application. The other one is used for exception handling, just one option how you can handle exceptions in a bounded task flow, which I'll cover later. Let's start with the unbounded task flow, which is configured in the adfc-config file, and that is equivalent to the default Faces config configuration for page navigation or view navigation. The ADFC config file is created by default, but you can have additional files created, which you do by selecting the View Controller project and choosing New from the context menu. In the Java Server Faces category in the project properties, you then select the ADF task flow entry. The dialog here has a checkbox which stands next to the Create a Bounded Task Flow prompt. Unselecting this checkbox creates another unbounded task flow that, when you OK the dialog, will create a reference from the ADFC config file to this file. The difference between the bounded task flow and unbounded task flow is that unbounded task flow definitions are loaded all at once. So that means if you have 3 unbounded task flow definitions, then the content of all of the 3 files will be loaded at once. Whereas in bounded task flows, the bounded task flow configuration is passed and initialized on request. So first time when the bounded task flow is needed, and as soon as you leave the task flow, it's dismissed and the memory is freed. So in unbounded task flow, it's not happening. So all at once, all definitions will load, and then they will keep there until the user exits the application. A use case for having multiple unbounded task flow definitions is where you want to use XML menu models in ADF. XML menu models allow you to design the page hierarchy on the side menu of your application. In this case, you can use ADFC config files and a chain of those files to design this page navigation hierarchy, and then generate the XML menu model out of that and use an ADF Faces component like the navigation pane to dynamically draw a menu on top of your pages. So let's have a look at the ADFC config file. First of all, it's all in metadata, as you can see here. Typically, when you open the file, it starts in a diagrammer view, which is what you're working with. You're not really, when you work with ADF Controller, have a lot of jobs to do in the XML view, so most of it is declaratively in the diagrammer view. You see the unbounded task flow as a label sitting on top of the diagrammer, and this really makes sense because the diagrammer is the same if you're editing unbounded task flows, bounded task flow, or bounded task flow templates. So it's always good to know what exactly you're editing here. Looking at the component palette, we can drag method call activities, route activities, task flow calls onto an unbounded task flow, the same set of functionality that we can use within bounded task flow. Difference though is if I drag and drop a view activity, this always is based on a JSPX document. An unbounded task flow cannot have views that are based on page fragments. To create the Browse Employees page, I can double click on the icon, after which the page creation dialog starts, or I can use a property inspector and on the page property browse for an existing page in my project and assign this to this view. Or if I have an existing page like I have with my Browse Department page, I drag and drop this onto the diagram and then it creates a view activity. In this case, my unbounded task flow has two entry points. One is the Browse Employees page and one the Browse Departments page. Of course, I can create navigation cases between them, and that I say, okay, I want to navigate from the Browse Department page to the Browse Employees for that department. I can just say browse so that I have the navigation established when a command item on the Browse Departments page would return browse as a label string in its action property. So for the sample, we only have one view activity here. We don't have any other activity than this single landing pad in the unbounded task flow. A feature worth explaining for unbounded task flows is bookmarking. Before Java Surfaces 2.0 and still within Java Surfaces 2.0, bookmarking a JSF page is not easy. The reason for this is that most of the navigation in a Java Surfaces application is through post-back navigation, which means it's a server-side navigation. In addition, the URL, if you look at a URL that comes with a JSF page, does not contain any query parameter, which makes it difficult for you to re-establish the state of a dynamic page based on a user pressing a bookmark. So to do this, there needs to be some preparation, and ADF Controller can do this for you. So I can select the view activity here and then set bookmark to true. Now what this does is that if I set bookmark to true, the ADF Controller now puts a flag into its metadata that when this page is requested, this view is requested, it will know that this needs to be bookmarkable. So it will perform a redirect and adding every query parameter onto the request URL that is needed to rebuild the state of the page. But how would it know what the query parameters are? Well, you tell it. And you tell it through using the bookmark URL parameters. So if I needed to pass a department ID, then I would, for instance, define a department ID request parameter. In here I use expression language string to point to an object in memory or in a managed bean or in the binding layer that the department ID value should be read from and later written to. So when someone presses the bookmarked URL, then with a query parameter this value is written back exactly to the location that I specified in the value. So if that is a managed bean, then the managed bean would have the value that was passed in from the requested URL. To make sure that the value comes within the proper object, I can specify a converter. The converter does two things. First of all, it converts string to object, and it converts object to string, so that I can have the back and forth translation of an object into a string, so it can be added to the URL, but also the way back. A string comes to my server, and here I need to have an object available, for instance Oracle JVO domain number, to resolve the bookmark string. The method that gets invoked is configured here in the method property, and again you use expression language for this. The method that gets invoked when someone invokes or requests a page through a bookmark URL will look into the various places where you stored the query parameters and make sure that it can rebuild the query that later on then allows the user to exactly see the page in a state that he or she bookmarked it in. What you can also use the converter for is to pass the query string, so you can make sure or check at least if the query parameters are used the way you would expect them to be used, or if someone is trying to hamper with the application. So let's start with the bounded task flows. Well, before building bounded task flows, let's hold on for a second and think about what we really want to do. A task flow, a bounded task flow, is a unit of processing, a functional module that I may or may not want to reuse. And we know that a bounded task flow in its initial behavior, in its default behavior, is configured on the property palette. So I can, for instance, specify transaction behavior, I can define parameters, I can define initialization behaviors, exception handling, I can define whether or not the bounded task flow would build its views with page fragments or page documents. Now if I have several task flow that all would require the same definition of a task flow, it's worth thinking about templating, especially if chances are that in the future I might have to change one or the other property setting, and then it's better to do it in a single place than just revisiting all the bounded task flows I created. So let's have a look at the task flow templating functionality that we have in Oracle JDeveloper. So you select new from the project's context menu. In the JSF category you select the ADF task flow template, and then you give the template a name. So in my case it's called tutorial standard task flow template. Of course, shorter names are welcome. Just go with dashes all the way. The second configuration, which by default is set to page fragments, is to define whether your bounded task flow runs with standalone pages, in which case they need to be created as JSPX documents, or as page fragments. So when I unselect this checkbox, then all the views, when I double click on that to create the physical file, would be created with JSPX documents. If I keep it selected, then we use page fragments. If to this time you don't know what type of task flow you're building, then no worries, because the bounded task flow itself later on can be refactored from page fragments to JSPX documents. However, the most common use case in ADF Controller is to use page fragments, so we stay with the default settings. You can specify if the bounded task flow is supposed to expose a train model. We talk about train models later in this session, so I keep that unselected, and then continue pointing out that you can build templates based on templates. So you can create little templates that you then chain together in a template that eventually you use with your bounded task flows. So let's press OK. And this creates my task flow template. And now, in contrast to unbounded task flows, this here says task flow template. So I know that I'm editing a template, which is important because I could add a bounded task flow to a page as an ADF region by drag and drop. But if I do the same with a template, it always opens with a template definition file, which might be confusing, but then reading the label I would be very clear on why things happen the way they happen. In the structure window, I select the task flow entry and see that the property inspector synchronizes with the task flow properties. In here I can set all the properties that are available for bounded task flows. One setting already is set, which is to use page fragments. I can change it here. I can just set it to false. I keep with the true, so I want to have this built with page fragments. Another setting is for visibility, which also makes a good candidate for a template setting. This visibility defines how a task flow is accessed. Now, do I want my task flow to be accessible from a browser? Or do I want to force users to start with a page in an unbounded task flow, as in my use case, and then from there, within the context of the application, call a bounded task flow? Yes, I want to do that. So I would set URL invoke disallowed, which means that no matter how hard you tried, this one is locked down. You're not able to get this bounded task flow outside of the running application. You want to set URL invoke allowed if the task flow is deployed on a remote server. One of the features that we talk at the end of this session about is the ability to deploy a bounded task flow to a remote server and then invoke it from an application, perform whatever the bounded task flow processes, and have it returning a value that then we further process in our application. In this case, the task flow needs to be allowed to be invoked by a URL. And then the default setting is calculated, and again, you only can invoke a task flow directly from a browser if it is built with a JSPX document. So in my case, I'm using page fragments. So I could easily say, okay, I set it to URL invoke disallowed because there's no way that you can run it standalone. But as mentioned, there's a refactoring option. The refactoring option will allow me to later on change my mind and create the same bounded task flow built on that template through refactoring with JSPX documents. In this case, it makes sense to think about, do I want to allow URL invoke? The calculated option means that only if a bounded task flow is created with a JSPX document, if it doesn't have an initialization method that is called right at the beginning when the bounded task flow loads, and if the default activity is a view activity, only then it would be accessible from a GET request. Yeah. So there is more kind of computation going on of whether or not this is accessible. So in my case, it's safe to say disallowed. And then I can continue specifying behavior. I can define my template to share the data control, which means that we have a synchronization between the data control collection, which is the parent collection and sits in the parent page or in a parent task flow that calls another task flow, and this task flow, if it exposes the detail collection to the parent collection, then the selection that you did in the parent would show automatically in the bounded task flow as well. So it's the easiest option that you have with ADF to synchronize between two different task flows. So I can specify it here, and like every other setting that I want to reuse, if you for instance work with the UI template shell, which I'm not covering in this session, but the UI template is the way to create a desktop-like user interface, and the template shell uses a context bean, and this context bean you would pass as a parameter to the called task flow, so that the called task flow could look into the context and whatever it needs to know about the context, work with that. And if you build your bounded task flow and you know that this bounded task flow needs to execute within the content of the UI shell template, then you can create an input parameter in your template, give it a name, have it pointed to a memory scope, and then you can make sure that every bounded task flow that you build out of that will have the ability to access the task flow context that is created by the UI shell. However, enough templating, let's get started with bounded task flows. A part of building bounded task flows is to think about what happens if things go wrong. And what usually happens is that you have some exception handler defined in your application to catch this exception. And the worst thing that could happen is that the exception just bubbles through and the browser actually just shows the stack trace, so the user who then is puzzled and confused and maybe out of control and angry. So to avoid this, you want to implement exception handling in a bounded task flow. And the exception handling in the bounded task flow, as a rule of thumb, should be as close as possible to where the exception could happen. So that means on the bounded task flow level, don't expect an exception to bubble from a cold bounded task flow to the parent task flow, but try to consistently handle exceptions on the bounded task flow level. Now, what if exception handling is the same in all bounded task flows? Well, in this case, a template approach makes a lot of sense. So, as we have still the template open, why don't we define the exception handler in the template instead of in the bounded task flow? You still can change your mind and have a task flow that's not referencing this template, and then the task flow itself would have an exception handling defined. I created a single page fragment, so I just drag and drop this into the template diagram here, and you see immediately it gets surrounded by this green halo here, which is in the bounded task flow case indicating the default activity. I don't want to have every bounded task flow starting with the exception handler. For that reason, I don't want this to become the default activity. So I click this icon here. You see I can toggle this halo back and forth. So I disable this as the default activity. But then there's another icon. If I click this, I mark this view as an exception handler. Depending on the type of exception, there are different ways for you as a developer to get out of the situation. One is to, as in the sample, just show the exception to the user, which is not nice, but at least it doesn't show in the stack trace if I'm not wanting it. But a better way is to use a route activity, for instance, as an exception handler. In this case, I could use the route activity conditional navigation to look into the error message or the error code and decide whether or not I can handle this exception gracefully, or if I have to notify the user. I could also use a method call activity as an exception handler. So anything dynamic, anything that helps me to recover from the exception without letting the user know is welcome here. So in my case, I want to continue with using the view activity because I want to show you something, and that is how to access the underlying API using expression language or Java. As you know, everything that you do within Oracle ADF, including ADF Controller, has a declarative and visual development environment. That's all nice, but it also has an API underneath, and this API provides a lot more functionality than really what is surfaced in declarative development. So let's open the view. So the view, let's resize it a bit, contains two text fields. And I wanted to use the text field just to display the error message, just a bit nicer than the browser would do. And this really would be the page for the last resort. If I don't know how to handle the exception gracefully, I would just bring this one up. So I go to the value property. There's an expression builder reference, and what I see in the expression builder dialog is there's an entry for ADF controller objects, and if I expand this, there's a controller context option. And then I need to think in views. The page I'm currently seeing, no matter if it's a JSPX document or a page fragment, is considered to be a view in ADF task flow vocabulary. So the current viewport, the current view, has a list of information that I can work with. One is exception data. So if there is an exception happening, which is because I ended up in the exception handler, so there must be some sort of exception. So I can select the message data, and I can, if it's a router, I can look into the message data, trying to identify the error code, and if I can deal with that or not, and then route the request to whatever makes it happen that the user can continue in the application. Or in my case, just display the error message through the expression language reference, and then I can do the same for the stack trace if I wanted to show that. I can also hide or show these different types of information based on the user's role membership. If it's a IT employee, then I might show the stack trace. Otherwise I would just show the message or maybe some instruction how to call help. So this is my page definition here, and that is all that I do in my demo here. In your case, as I mentioned, you would use a method call activity or route activity to do a lot nicer exception handling than what I'm doing here. But this, for now, it's fine, it's nice. So that means that all my bounded task flow that I built on top of that template will have exception handling. And if I'm using bounded task flow that use JSPX documents, then if there is a bounded task flow without exception handling, then it will post the exception handling to the parent flow, so the calling flow. If the bounded task flow is in an ADF region, then of course the browser is the next stop to handle it. So it's always good to have an exception handler in your bounded task flow, and if the exception handler is to be configured consistent, so if there's no specific handling for a specific bounded task flow, you can put the exception handler into the task flow as I did it here. The application I showed you at the beginning at runtime has two bounded task flows. One bounded task flow to show detail information to a selected parent collection in the containing page, the parent page of my ADF region, and the other one to edit a selected detail information to change employee data. The first bounded task flow I called the employee detailed bounded task flow, and the second one the employee edit bounded task flow. To create a bounded task flow, you use the right mouse context menu on the View Controller project, and in the JSF category you choose ADF task flow, and then you press OK and provide a name. So the name in this case is employee detail bounded task flow, detail bounded task flow. This abbreviation BTF to indicate bounded task flow is a very popular abbreviation in the ADF community, so we should follow that one. By default it's created with page fragments. I could define a train model here similar to what I could do with in my template definitions, so I leave that out for the same reason, as we're covering trains later. But I want to base this on an existing template, and you see that my tutorial template, as it's the only template I have in my project, is automatically selected. I do have the option to decide whether I want to have the template being referenced or copied into my bounded task flow. If it's referenced, like by default it's updated when the template changes. If it's not referenced, but if the template gets copied into the bounded task flow, then the advantage I'm getting is that if I, for instance, specified an exception handler, or if I have navigation even defined in the template, this becomes visual in my task flow diagram, because now the elements become part of the source of my task flow diagram. Whatever I reference in form of a template doesn't show visually in my bounded task flow diagram. So the exception handler, for example, will not show in my task flow diagram when I work on the bounded task flow. But because I don't need that information, because I know there is exception handling defined, so I don't need to know exactly how the exception handling is defined. In a team development environment, exception handling might even be out of my scope. Someone else would have implemented that, so why do I want to bother? So I go with the update the task flow when the template changes, so I reference the task flow and then end up with a blank sheet of bounded task flow. So, and I do the same for the edit bounded task flow. Again, same selection, and employee edit bound task flow, and again select the template and create the bounded task flow. If you recall the runtime demo that I showed early in the beginning, then you remember that there was a parent collection in form of an input form, a navigatable form that you could use to select a department, and then the employee record in the bounded task flow that was exposed on that page in a region synced up and showed the employees for that department. So this is what the employee detail bounded task flow is doing. The easiest way to get this synchronization working is to share the data control, which of course is the default setting. So under the behavior category, there is a transaction setting, and by default the bounded task flow will share that data control. And in our template that we used, we did also set the data control to be shared because we didn't override this default setting. When I share a data control, and if the collection, the view object, if you work with ADF Business Components, is dependent on the view object in the parent, then through the shared data control, the master detail synchronization will be automatically handled. This makes it very easy. All that you need to do is to set the partial triggers property on the ADF region tag to point to the form navigation controls, like the navigation buttons in the sample. And then every click on this button will refresh the employee detail. Now this is the easy one. But there is a more complex situation, which is if you want to have the two task flows running their own transactions, which means that they are independent collections. So a change in the parent collection does not necessarily have an impact to the iterator and the detail. So you have to manually enforce the detail to refresh. The benefit of having isolated bounded task flows is that you have a cleaner separation between the parent flow and the detail flow, and this makes the detail flow a much better candidate for reuse in other projects and other applications. To isolate the data control, I unselect this checkbox, share data control with calling task flow. So this now separates them out. At runtime, ADF will create two data control frames, as we call it, so two different transactions, and then it's the data control and the business service to interpret this and implement it. So in the ADF Business Components send, what happens is like you will have kind of a second root application module implicitly built that opens up a separate transaction for the bounded task flow if the two sharing the data control. Could also be that the bounded task flow doesn't use the same data control as the parent, which is also an option. Next thing I want to do is I want to tell through the controller what the business service should do with this transaction, and in this case I tell it that always a new transaction should be built. Again, this is just a setting on the controller level, and it's up to the business service to interpret the settings that come from the controller and then do the right thing. If you use web services, for example, there's no transaction in the web service scenario. In this case, this setting might be ignored, but that's fine. What the impact is, it always will have, is to the controller. A controller that sets a bounded task flow or has a bounded task flow set to always begin new transaction expects you to leave that task flow either by committing or rolling back the transaction. So you will have to use a return activity with commit or rollback. In our scenario, we have an isolated bounded task flow which always begins a new transaction. To communicate between the parent and this detail bounded task flow, we use parameters. And every bounded task flow exposes input parameters and return value definitions. And these two make the contract between the bounded task flow that you call or that you integrate on a page and the calling page or task flow. For my bounded task flow, I need to pass in an information about the department ID for which I need to query the employee records. So I define an input parameter as department ID param. The class property is something that you can ignore. It's not considered at runtime and not even considered at design time. The value property is important. The value property does not point to the value of the department ID parameter. It points to the location where the value of this parameter will be stored for the called bounded task flow. So the detailed task flow gets called, a department ID parameter is passed in, and I need to save this value in a memory scope that lasts for as long as the bounded task flow runs, or at least as long as it takes me to reuse that value within a query or whatever. Yeah. So value does not mean it's the value of the input parameter. It means that it's the target, the location where you store the value. Here you have two options. You can store the value in a memory property like page flow scope and then department ID as an attribute. This will hold the value in memory. Or you use a managed bean and you configure the managed bean to live in a page flow scope and then reference a managed bean property. As a best practice, I suggest you always use a managed bean. I have created a managed bean. Well, it's not yet configured as a managed bean, but I created a POJO that I called employee detail process bean. And this bean right now has one property which is called department ID param. And then I created a setter and a getter for this. The benefit of using a managed bean to hold the data is, first of all, you can document and comment a managed bean as I did in this sample. If you're working in teams, then it's always good to know what the developer creating a specific contract had in mind when doing so. Second, if it's a managed bean, I can use expression language and the expression language builder in JDeveloper to discover what actually the input parameters are and where they are stored. So next step is to take this employee process bean and configure this for my employee detail bounded task flow. And as mentioned, a bounded task flow is a configuration file, and this configuration file provides you with the option to configure managed beans on it, and these managed beans will be used at runtime within the process flow. So I create a new managed bean. So let's call it employee detail process bean. The class, we just look that up on the class path. Here it is. And the scope we will set to page flow. The page flow scope is the scope that spans the whole process, the whole time I spend in this bounded task flow. So I'm saving this, go back to the diagram view, and now what I can do is I can go back to the input parameter, and in here I use expression builder from the property palette, ADF managed beans, page flow scope. You see the different scopes that are supported by the ADF controller, and we talk about this separately. Here I have an employee detail process bean. Don't get confused by this here. This actually is the mirror of the department ID parameter I specified. So this does not have any value, it's just a name. It shouldn't even show. So always look for the bean here, because this is where you want to get the information from. So I select this, and this here is the string that gets added to the value field. Then the last parameter you have is required. If you set this to required, so if I check mark this, then whenever you drag and drop a bounded task flow onto a task flow diagram to be called in a task flow call activity, or you drag and drop this onto a page to be used as a region, it will ask you to provide a value that you point it to. Yeah, so if there is a parameter that you definitely need in your bounded task flow, making it required, we'll make sure that the developer consuming your bounded task flow knows about that. So that's pretty much what I needed to prepare the bounded task flow for. And now it's time to add some logic. So first of all, what I did prepare on the model side is that I have a view criteria, and the view criteria uses a bind variable in ADF Business Components to query employee records based on the input of the department ID. I then created a client interface, and this client interface, which actually is created on the employee view. Here's the impl class, and this impl class has a set department ID variable and get department ID variable, and this you configure declaratively on the view object by setting its Java option. So if I double click on the employees view object, then go to the Java option, then I can use this pencil icon to create the implementation class, and the client interface actually determines which of the methods that I'm generating is exposed on the data control, so I can use that. So in this case, I exposed the method to set the bind variable on the data control. So if I close this, if I go to the data control, then one of the methods we see is the set department ID number. So what I want to do is, because when my bounded task flow is initiated, I want to query the employee data based on what the department ID is. Yeah? And I pass the department ID as an input parameter. So the first thing I do is I drag and drop this method from the data control palette onto the task flow diagram. And here it will show as a method call activity. When I drag and drop the set department ID variable method to the diagram in the ADF controller bounded task flow, then it pops up this action binding dialog, because the method expects an argument that I need to reference an object for using expression language. The value for this field is the expression language string that points to the managed bean that I created before, and it points to the department ID parameter in there. So we have department ID param, and this is in page flow scope, and now whenever this method call activity executes, it will read that value from the managed bean and then set it in the business service. You also see this green halo around it. This is indicating that this is a default activity, meaning that this bounded task flow will always start processing on the default activity, so there's no way around. Doesn't matter if the default activity is a router or a view activity, bounded task flows always execute starting with the default activity. The next step for me is to execute the query so that the department ID that I passed in filters the list of employees. In ADF Business Components, there is a set of operations that are exposed on the view object, and here we use the execute to execute the query. Again, this creates a method call activity. By setting the bind variable and then executing the view object query, we get a complete new set of data in our collection, which is then filtered by the department ID. If you're not using ADF Business Components but web services or Pojo, then still you can use that approach, but then the equivalent method needed to be exposed on the session facade or on the web service. But drag and drop is all that you would do. Next step is to create the employee overview view. So let's call this employee overview. On this page, we just want to show the details that are queried, and we also want to make sure that there is a button that allows us to edit the selected employee, and the edit will be a call to the subflow, to the employee detail edit subflow. And then once we have this, we want to also add a commit button, and we want to later on add a button that allows us to undo an action, but this comes later. So first, continue with adding a navigation to the bounded task flow call that is for the edit task flow. So for this we need to expand the webinf directory under the public HTML, and here we have our edit task flow. We drag and drop this in, and this gets rendered as a task flow call activity. When I open up the property inspector, then you see that the task flow call activity also has some behavior with it, and that you can configure. So one would be to start the called bounded task flow in a dialog, but then also it has a section for input parameters and return values, just in case that the bounded task flow you call expects you to pass data in or to return values. In the case of the edit task flow, as we will create next, the task flow shares the data control with this bounded task flow, so it's not creating an isolated instance. Plus, it will synchronize with the selected table row for that reason, so that we don't need to pass input parameters in. So all that it would do is it would allow us to just have a multi-step wizard to edit the data and then eventually return and have the table refreshed. Next step is to create navigation cases between the different activities, and for this, first of all, we need to make sure that there is a return for the input parameter, but that comes from the bounded task flow. So we go to the component palette, and so we do return here, just drawing the line. If you leave the asterisk instead of providing a name, then whatever the bounded task flow would return that you called through the task flow call activity would lead to that navigation. So if it doesn't matter what really returned the task flow call, then that's fine, and you could use the asterisk. So edit would cause navigation from the employee overview to the bounded task flow, and then this one here, oops, that was wrong, so wanted to have the control flow, just drawing the control flow, and this goes with a default naming because there's a default outcome configured on the method call activity, so the fixed outcome is set to the name of the method by default. If you want to have more descriptive naming of what the intention is, then for instance, if you wanted to name this execute query, then you would also have to rename this outcome string to the same name, because this is the requirement that ADF Controller has to make sure that it navigates to the correct activity. Last thing is to navigate from the execute method activity to the employee view. Because this bounded task flow is meant to navigate endlessly, because bounded task flows that run in an ADF region usually don't have an exit criteria unless there's a use case for such an exit criteria. An exit criteria would be where you use the return activity. So I drag the return activity, and if this bounded task flow was called by another task flow, then the return activity will make this task flow exit and return to the calling task flow. Now, if this bounded task flow is enclosed in an ADF region, if it's operating as part of a page, then as I mentioned, the use case is very unlikely that you want to have a return statement, but you can. There is a possibility that you have a listener listening on the region for this task flow return, and then you would do the right thing in your code. Example could be you have a checkout of a shopping cart. To some point, though it's executing as a region, you don't want to have this executed in a loop, so to some point you would just have return statement you would catch the fact that the return is called and then either navigate the parent page to another page, maybe a shopping summary, or you would just start a new shopping process. What you see is that there is a error marker on the return activity, and this is because we have the bounded task flow configured to require an exit to be either rollback or commit. And you see the end transaction property of the return activity is highlighted. So if exiting the application through this return activity is equivalent to a submit or success, it will commit the transaction, and then I could also have another one which would be a cancel, like this purchase is not happening. So I would call this cancel, and then I can set this one to rollback. Because the transaction is isolated in this bounded task flow, committing or rolling back the transaction in the bounded task flow will not have an impact to the transaction that you have open in the parent flow. So later at runtime, in my use case, if I would change the department name and then change an employee name and then commit in the bounded task flow that displays the employee, then only the transaction for the employee would be committed. The rest would be just left open. In our use case, we don't really want to exit the bounded task flow, so I'm undoing this operation and continue with building the employee page. So let's have a look at the employee overview page, which in fact is a page fragment that runs in the context of an ADF region. It has a table which has a configuration set to single row selection, so that when I click into the table, the synchronization is such that on the page definition file, the ADF binding file, the current row is selected, and it has two buttons. One button that is configured to navigate to the task flow call activity, and this task flow call activity references the edit bounded task flow that we're going to build next, for leading us through the steps required to edit the current employee record and later on return the changed data. And it has a commit button, and as you can see, the commit operation is taken from the data control, just dragging this onto the page and then choose the control that you want it to be rendered with. If you're working with a non-ADF business components environment, then you would use an equivalent method exposed on the session facade or on the service that you use. Committing the transaction within ADF business components will only commit the transaction in this bounded task flow. Remember that I configured this bounded task flow explicitly to run in isolation mode, so it's not sharing the data control, so it's a separate instance of the data control. So committing this transaction will commit only this transaction here. So next is that we need to have a look at how to build the employee edit bounded task flow. I like to use the employee edit bounded task flow to first go through the list of properties that we have available for bounded task flow to define the default behavior. One property, for example, that we talked about already is the default activity, which is the defined entry point to a bounded task flow. So no matter how you request the bounded task flow, either from a URL, if it's accessible from a GET request, or from within an application by just calling a task flow call activity or using a region, this is the activity that is always processed first. In the employee detail form, this was a method call activity, and this was surrounded with a green shadow to indicate this default activity. If you have several activities on a diagram, then you can use the select box here that you see on the right hand side to change the default activity, or you just use the icon in the diagram toolbar. The exception handler allows you to specify the component or the activity that is responsible for handling exceptions. Initializer is a property that allows you to configure a managed bean, and the managed bean method that you configure will be called right when the bounded task flow starts, when it initializes. So this is even before the first activity is executed or the first view is drawn on a page or navigated to. Finalizer does the same just for exiting a bounded task flow, so it allows you to respond to the closer of a bounded task flow. And remember that the task flow call activity also had initializer and finalizer methods. So you have 4 hook points where you can listen for an application calling into a task flow. A save point restore finalizer, we haven't yet talked about save point facilities, but if you restore to a specific state that you saved up before, then when this save point is getting restored, the last thing it does, it calls the finalizer, just in case that you have to set up some resources that are not saved in the snapshot. Users page fragment, we talked about that. Visibility, we talked about that. This is the reference to the task flow document, which is in the web.inf directory, the template reference. You can provide a display name, some description to the task flow, which is not exposed to the outside, but actually helps you to document the task flow herein. We already used the managed bean facility, so you can configure a managed bean for the bounded task flow. In my previous example where I configured the managed bean in the employee detail bounded task flow, I used the overview tab and selected the managed bean in here. But you can also use this dialog here to configure a managed bean. We talked about parameters, so bounded task flows might have input parameters and return value definitions. Behavior, here we have a setting on the employee edit form for train, and we need to talk about train. By default the setting is to false. Here we set it to true because I want to have this bounded task flow to expose a train model that allows us to have an alternative way of navigating within the bounded task flow, and you will see how this works and where it's getting us to. For every bounded task flow you can specify how you want to have it to respond to re-entry, and here we mean the re-entry using the browser back button. If you set re-entry allowed, then users are okay to navigate back, entering the task flow if they exited the task flow before, and then submit a query, so nothing would complain about that. But if you set task flow re-entry not allowed, then what happens is that an exception will be thrown by the framework notifying the developer, in this case that a user used the back button to resubmit a previously submitted form, and then you respond to that and you can send the user to an information page or just continue with the way that's most appropriate for the application flow. And there's another option here that is re-entry outcome dependent. Now this now makes it dependent on how you exit a task flow. So say that I exit a task flow with a success operation like a commit. In this case I could set on the return activity that the re-entry should not be allowed. So if I set re-entry outcome dependent, then on the return activity I tell it how I want re-entry being handled. If I return from a cancel operation, I might set on the return activity then that re-entry is allowed, because users might just need to go back and forth to correct some data, and then they would be happy with the data entry and submit the request then. The critical property is what you would use with save points, and we'll talk about save point in the second session of this 2-part series. There are implicit save points that you can create, which is that if you mark a task flow as critical, then that means that no matter what happens, the outcome or the result after exiting this task flow need to be recoverable. So if something fails later on, I want to make sure that I'm getting back to this state that I left this in. Transaction settings, we talked about that, the different ways that you can flag transactions, always begin new transaction. These are merely flags for the controller, that the controller passes to the data control and the data control to the business service, and then the implementation is purely on the data control and business service side. The ADF controller does not handle any transaction itself. A save point transaction or save point for a task flow transaction is on the business side, on the business service side, that this will only recover to a specific save point on the transaction, whereas the save point I'm talking here about, and it becomes more obvious when we have the slides for that, then you will see this does save a lot more than just the transaction. It also reaches out to the current view state and the controller state. So it snapshots a lot more than this transactional snapshot here. And then you have the ability to specify how you want to have metadata customization handled. Do you want to allow customization on this controller, or do you not want to allow that? And if you want to allow that, do you want to restrict this by a specific application rule the user needs to be in? So these are the list of properties that you can set, that you can work with in every bounded task flow to give it a default behavior. Before continuing with the employee edit bounded task flow, let me quickly explain what trains are, because that's exactly what we want to implement in this bounded task flow. So first of all, a train is a menu, is a model. Every view activity that you flag as a train stop, or every task flow call activity that you flag as a stop, can be navigated using one of the two components, the AF train component or the AF train button component. The AF train component is a horizontal or vertical line with stop bullets on it that represent a view or task flow call activity. Users can then navigate sequentially or non-sequentially through the path that you define within the train model. The train button bar is a backward and forward button that sequentially walks over the train model so that users can navigate back and forth based on the current train stop they're on. The train model is exposed on the bounded task flow through the controller context. So the string, the expression language string, controller context, current viewport, task flow context, train model is always the same string, which means that a train or a train button bar could be added to a page template, because the controller expression doesn't change, so there's no bounded task flow specific naming in there or page specific naming in there, which makes it a perfect candidate for a template. And then users can use the train or the train button bar as a convenient way to navigate through a longer process. The train especially gives users a lot more confidence in a multi-step process than the typical next button that you can define with control buttons. In the diagrammer, the train navigation model is indicated by a dotted line. So here on the information view, there's a dotted line to the define address, a dotted line to payment options. So these make the train, and you can see that the train might have a completely different navigation path than the control flow cases, which also means that if you use a mix of control flow cases and train navigation, that you have to synchronize navigation such that no business logic is bypassed. So either you're not exposing control flows on a command button, so that users have to use the train components to navigate through an application, and you use internally in the program logic the control flow cases, or you make sure that either way will make sure no business logic is bypassed. So let's have a look now in our employee edit bounded task flow how trains are configured and how they are set up so that in the page you see the train stop or the train button bar rendered. As mentioned, to expose a navigation path in the bounded task flow for use in a train or a train button bar component, I need to set the train property to true. Remember that we've seen this property two times. First time when we created the bounded task flow template, and the second time when we built the bounded task flows. In the creation dialog there is a checkbox that you can use to configure the bounded task flow to expose the train model. With the task flow being enabled to expose views and task flow call activities as train stops, every view activity that you drag and drop onto the diagram automatically is flagged as a train stop. So let's partition the data that we need to input for the employee data to a personal data form, a job-related data form, and an HR-related data form. So the next is the job-related form, and you see that automatically the two view stops are linked by a dotted line, indicating that this is in the sequence the navigation that you can go. Now HR-related, like salary, very important. So this is the three-step wizard that I created for the employee data. If you have existing view activities on a bounded task flow, when you switch the task flow to expose the train model, then those view activities are not enabled by default as a train stops. But on the view activity context menu, there's a configuration option that allows you to move a specific activity in the hierarchy of the train model, or even to remove it from the train, or to create or actually add this view activity if it's not part of the train as a train stop. Selecting one of the view activities and selecting the property inspector, you see that the train stop property is set to true for all the view activities that are listed as train stops, but there are additional properties for you to set. The outcome property allows you to specify a control flow case. When the user clicks on the train stop, then the train stop will follow the control flow case. This is what you would normally do if you want to execute a method activity prior to accessing the view that is represented by train stop. Like you want to create a new record. In this case, you would create a wildcard navigation case for the method call activity and create a navigation from the method call activity to the view activity that is the train stop. In this outcome, you would do the wildcard control flow case name, and then this way you can invoke methods on the fly as you navigate in a train. Sequential, if you set this to true, then this means that it's always the previous and the next train stop that is enabled when you're on a current stop. Skip means that you can bypass a specific train stop. So if based on some conditions, business logic, you want to bypass, you want to disable a train, then you can do this using the skip property. Ignore property is read when the bounded task flow is initialized. This would help you to pass in an input parameter that would completely hide one of the train stops. So the difference here is it's not disabled, it's completely hidden. It's not part of the train model. The skip and the sequential properties can be used with expression language. Ignored as well, but keep in mind that ignored only is looked at when the task flow initializes, not later, where sequential and skip can be dynamically changed. If you reference a managed bean that returns true or false, then this could be independent on the business logic. So this is the train navigation model that we created. The next step is that we want to further configure the train stops. Would be nice to have a display name shown next to it, or have a tooltip. So I select the view activity that is marked as a train stop, and now I have to go to the structure window for that. And when I expand the structure window, I see the train stop as an element in here. Right mouse click on it and then insert inside train stop, and I can choose the display name. And then the display name would be set in this case to person, and I can of course internationalize that, so I can have a resource bundle reference using expression language so that the person or the job could be translated to the language that the user is more comfortable with. And then I also have insert train, and I can choose description, and this is personal data, and then I would continue with job job view activity as well as a train stop defined, insert train stop, display name, and I'm going to call it job, and so on. The next step then is to create page fragments for each of the views that you have here, plus you need to find a way to exit this bounded task flow, because the bounded task flow is called from another bounded task flow using the task flow call activity. And here you would specify task flow return activities. Just drag and drop them. So you would call one submit and one just cancel. The cancel operation could be just to restore to a save point. And remember when I said that there's a transactional save point, and this save point by default is taken whenever bounded task flow share the same transaction. So I can say, okay, restore to a save point. So when I navigate to this return activity, then implicitly using ADF Business Components, everything that you changed so far is undone. And then I would use this navigation and say submit. I can also specify different return activities. That is that on the general tag I have an outcome. So if I set this to submit and this is set to cancel by default, I can have navigation cases in the calling task flow, because what happens when I'm exiting this bounded task flow, I'm returning to the task flow call activity. And if the task flow call activity has a control flow case created for cancel and for submit, then dependent on the way that I get out of a bounded task flow, navigation continues in the parent task flow. So this is the whole navigation flow for me to create. So just quickly create a page. Later on I will show you the more compact page and how this gets created. What we want to see is how the train stop is added. So I go to the component palette, and then in the common components there's an entry which is called train or train button bar. So I drag and drop the train into the page, and you see JDeveloper is smart enough to automatically complete the expression language. All I need to do is just to press OK, and then at runtime this looks into the bounded task flow definition, and from the bounded task flow we'll get the information about the view activities that are part of the train. If this was a template, then the template, because it's not part of a bounded task flow but be used in a task flow, the train would not automatically be configured. But given that the string never changes, you know how to get the string and copy and paste that in. So this is all that it takes to create a train. And all that I need to do now is, and it's more a work that is keeping me busy for a while than really exciting, is to take this collection here and create new ADF forms. So for the personal data, so first name, last name, that's definitely personal data, email as well, and then I could just remove the whole thing and pass this on to other pages. I can use a submit button, and the submit button would be good to edit those records. But if the submit button does not point to a control flow case, then I'm actually staying on the page, so I can have just the train model for navigation. So and this is what I would do for the other views in the train as well, and at the end I will have a multi-step wizard to fill in the data for the employees view. I already talked about the access restriction that exists for bounded task flows, but because this is security relevant, I want to stress this fact a bit further. The bounded task flow has a property called URL invoke, and this knows about 3 states: calculated, disallowed, and allowed. If you set it to calculate, then this task flow can be called directly from a browser if all three conditions are true. The bounded task flow has to start with a view activity as its default activity. It should not have an initializer method set, and it should not have page fragments. So it should be based on page documents. If these three are true, then calculated means that you can get access to the bounded task flow from a browser URL. If you disallow a bounded task flow from external access, then any attempt to access the task flow from a GET request will return an HTTP 4.3 error code. If you set it to allow, then this bounded task flow can be accessed from any browser for any remote access, no matter what. The ability to invoke a task flow from remote is relevant if you want to have task flow being called from remote. There's the facility where, and I mentioned that, you can call a remote deployed bounded task flow from within an ADF application. Control is passed over to this bounded task flow sitting on a completely different server, and then a return comes back and your calling application continues where you actually left it by calling the remote task flow. This concludes part 1 of the 2-part series on task flows in Oracle ADF. So we already did cover quite a lot there. So I explained task flow concepts, bounded and unbounded. We talked about declarative exception handling. Of course, there's always more in-depth knowledge that you can gather around this, but for now, as an introduction, I think we covered that pretty well. And then we talked about trains as an alternative navigation route through the bounded task flow. In the second part of this series, we will talk about memory scopes. You briefly saw me selecting a memory scope, which is page flow scope, and you may have seen that there's a view scope, a backing bean scope. Now, but what does that really mean? So that's part of the second part. And then we talk about how we expose a bounded task flow in a region, what you should know about that. Save for later is the snapshot that we can take not only from the transaction but also from the visual state, so that we can recover to a specific visual state. We talk about exposing a task flow as a dialog. So instead of calling a task flow and it opens up in the same browser window, we want to launch that as a dialog, and then eventually we finish with a more in-depth look at how do you use a bounded task flow as a remote service. Not that it's exposed as a web service, but it's exposed as a service that you can leverage from within your ADF application. You just can call out, as I explained several times already. If you want to learn more about ADF in general, just go to the Oracle JDeveloper homepage, which is on oracle.com technology JDev, where you can find downloads, tutorials, you have access to the discussion forums, you find samples and the developer guides that we continue writing on. The ADF Insider homepage is listed here. There is a very in-depth topic on region interaction and region communication, which goes beyond of what we cover in the second part of the series. So you see there's already a follow-up video available. Sample code that uses task flows, of course, is available on ADF Code Corner, which provides you a lot of samples and tricks that as a ADF developer you may need to know about. So this concludes the first part of the series. See you after a coffee break with the second part, which also is available on ADF Insider.